fact, it's very, very overrated.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Strike Rate, the Cricket Analytics podcast with me, Jack Hope, and Dan Weston, our tame analyst. I don't know where tame analyst came from there. I felt like I had to say something. We're going through all the batting metrics that we can think of, or a lot of the batting metrics that we can think of, and basically giving you our thoughts on them and whether they're very useful or not when it comes to assessing players' value. If you have any questions based on the discussions that we are having, please do find us on Twitter. Find Dan on Twitter at SA Advantage, and reach out to us because we'll be doing a big, Q&A, I think, about a lot of this, or we'll be doing a bigger question and answer session on next week's podcast. Dan, we were about to get on to batting average, which is in many ways the daddy metric when it comes to cricket. People are always talking about batting averages. In T20 cricket, what are your thoughts?
Okay, so obviously, as you say, it's often the benchmark that the players are judged on in Test cricket, but I'm not necessarily sure that there's so much scope for it to be as valued in T20, primarily because, and we'll talk about kind of balls per dismissal a little bit related to this as well, is that they often tend to be reverse correlated with strike rate, which, it's the trade-off often between stability and aggressive intent. So, for example, Milan's average, we've been focusing on him for the example here of his quick info page. He averages just over 32 at a strike rate of 129. So you can look at that straight away and say that even though a lot of his careers, or some of his career, has been in a lower scoring era, he's definitely fitting like that anchor dynamic of high average and relatively low strike rate. You can ascertain a little bit from that. Whether it shows you that he's an above replacement player, for example, is another debate. And also it doesn't quite give you much insight into the role that the player is trying to accomplish. If someone struck at 129 batting that number 7 or number 8, that's pretty disastrous. If it's at 3, maybe you could say that's about acceptable with a high average, but on the whole, again, it doesn't really provide us with a massive amount of insight compared to Test cricket, where I was speaking to someone the other day who played a lot of Test cricket, and he said, the benchmark was always over 40. You always had to average over 40 to be considered a very good Test batter, and the average in T20 cricket is not by any means as important.
Yeah, if we want to talk about it, and I think average is a really interesting one. And I think that it's an interesting one from a role perspective, because obviously in some roles you want a high average, like it's or a higher average, but there's also, and this is it kind of gets a little bit complex here. Sometimes a high average is actually indicative of a player that probably isn't adding that much value in, and if you look at it alongside their strike rate. Yeah, they might sort of be using so many resources for such little production in terms of the efficiency of how they are using those resources, that the average is telling you that they're kind of blocking off the rest of the team in a way. If you want benchmarks, though, the mean benchmark over the last 3 years has been about 26. Interestingly, that benchmark is only achieved by 44% of players. So the players over that number are kind of dragging up the mean benchmark. If you like. To be in the top 10% of players, your average would need to be 34.8 or higher. And I've added as well, when I was doing this, doing my benchmarks, I added replacement level, which I set at the bottom 25%. So I don't love using replacement level for average, because I don't think that I like average that much in T20 cricket. But I'm gonna tell people so that they know what the replacement level is, and that was 19.9. So if you're thinking about thresholds, and I really would emphasize with average, and I probably think you would as well, Dan, that you want to think about the role the player's playing as well, and whether average matters at all. But they're what we're talking about. There, do you want to know who the highest average in who?
Oh, give me the rankers.
Right, so Rizwan has the top average. Yeah, 52.97. Babar Azam 52.84. So it's yeah, definitely really close between them. King Legend KL Rahul, he's
definitely anchor. I mean, he says strike rates are overrated.
He named the podcast. We've got Rinku Singh next, but it's a relatively small sample.
Yeah.
Relatively small sample here. So he's only been out 13 times in the last 3 years in major leagues. So it's a little bit tighter. And I'll not in the top 5, but right near the top of the list. And I think we'll probably be talking about him a little bit more as the podcast goes on, because I think he's just so good. Klaassen. He's in the top 2.5% of players when it comes to average, and his name's going to come up again. Like,
so he's probably one right now who does that. That he doesn't have that trade-off in terms of stability versus intent. Like, he's managed to combine both really effectively. And actually, another South African historically was consistently good in that respect as well, and that was A.B. de Villiers, who consistently struck way over the average, and then also had high balls per dismissal and average as well. So, and that's the mark, I think, of a true T20 great, is the players who can combine those two things. Pete Butler was probably around that at points as well. But the vast majority of players are either good at one or the other if you're comparing strike rate and average. So someone who's doing both is exceptional. And if Rinku Singh can carry on that, I mean, he's going to be like legendary status. He'll have legendary status. I think it's probably going to have a little bit of mean reversion over some time, but he looks a real talent for sure.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. If you, I think I talked about the average being about 26. We're thinking it's interesting. We were using his Cricket Info profile. Milan over the last 3 years in major T20 comps has an average of about 26. So, that's what there's some players to illustrate what we're talking about there. If we're not using average, and you see this one used slightly more by a slightly more analytical crowd, I would say. We've got balls per dismissal, which literally counts the number of times or number of balls you face per number, or divided by the number of outs that you have been. I like that metric more, Dan. I don't know about you. Can you tell us a little bit about it and how it would be used and any other thoughts?
Yeah, likewise, I much prefer comparing, say, balls per dismissal and strike rate than average and strike rate, because the strike rate element is already going to have some weighting in the average already, whereas it doesn't in the balls per dismissal. The two things are largely independent. So you can really, really get a lot more insight into who the anchors and hitters are if you compare balls per dismissal, which is effectively a measure of how much stability a player offers, how much they value their wicket compared to strike rate or boundary percentage. We're going to talk about later on in terms of the aggressive intent that they're displaying on a consistent basis. So I like the two things to compare strike rate and balls per dismissal. I think that's probably a better comparison for sure.
If we're looking at benchmarks for that, the mean benchmark's 19.3. So that's I guess the average player is out every 3.1 overs. Obviously, this is really role specific too.
Yeah,
your wicket doesn't really matter in the 19th and 20th over. It matters quite a lot in the first and second over. So you want to think about that. The elite players have a ball per dismissal rate over 26, so 26.1 would get you into the top 10%, and the bottom 25%, 15.6. And again, like, you do want to consider whether this metric is relevant. If you're talking about a number 8, if their balls per dismissal is 7, but they're scoring at 200, you're probably all right with that. Like, it's a trade-off that works. Yeah, exactly.
Most hitters or number 8s or whatever, number 9s would be delighted with 14 off 7 on a consistent basis.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, like there would be it'd be job well done, wouldn't it? Top of the tree. We've mentioned some of these guys already, and it will obviously match up because average and balls per dismissal they are linked. Rizwan 40.3 balls per dismissal. Now we were saying that a high average combined with a low strike rate might not be great for your team, and this is where I would start to question whether a guy using 33% of the balls in an innings and scoring at 1.3 runs a ball off those balls is hugely efficient. But he's given you great stability, so I think that would probably depend on the makeup of your team and what you were trying to do, right, Dan? You wouldn't.
There's a lot
of crap.
Yeah. I mean, you wouldn't want a player like that in a team with weak bowling because you know they're going to be chasing big scores and needing to post big scores to defend. Whereas in a bowling strong team, that could work.
Yeah, and if we're looking at some guys near the average benchmark, Harry Brook out every 19.4 balls. Laurie Evans, who English T20 cricket fans will probably know a fair amount about. Like, that's the kind of baseline we're looking at. And Dhoni, right in that mix as well. Like Dhoni is out more or less the bang average amount in
which I guess is
T20 cricket.
7 or something like that, right? That's got to be above for number 7.
Yeah, in that group, in the little bracket that I'm looking at, it's mainly top order batters around him. So, literally on the same number, Ridham Saha, for example, Nicholas Pooran, Jason Roy, like they're much higher up the order. And then if you go right down the bottom, you've got someone like Narayan, and we were talking about, or Jordan Thompson, who are the kind of guys who are aiming for that 14 off 7 balls when they bat. So yeah, a little run through those. Dan, the next one I have on the list, or the next metric, and we'll go back to something that you can find on Cricket Info, and you don't have to work out yourself in a spreadsheet, is strike rate. Now, if batting average is the daddy for Test cricket, strike rate's probably the daddy for T20 cricket. Do you want to give us your thoughts?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it shows you the average amount of runs that player will score if they face 100 balls. So, for example, going back to the Milan example here, strike rate of 129.48, so it scores 1.2948 per ball on average. It is useful because we start to know whether a player is able to attack on a consistent basis and to strike at a better or worse rate than their peers. However, again, there's no context involved in this bare number. We don't know what role the players are playing. We don't know who he's playing for. A strike rate of 130 in a big bash is a lot different to a strike rate of 130 in the blast or something like that, where bowler quality is different and the boundary sizes are considerably different as well. So, there's a lot of context to be had in these numbers. And this is what I do feel that there's scope for a site to offer more detailed metrics, but also show benchmarks and kind of role specific stuff as opposed to just kind of what people have always used for Test cricket.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that, and the fact that I've had to build a spreadsheet from scratch to do this episode and give those benchmarks is, it's reflective of cricket's analytical world. Mean benchmark for strike rate, and this will be a bit higher than the actual number in games because it doesn't include basically any bowlers. There's a cut off. So 135. If you're a batter and you've faced 150 balls and you're playing in the major leagues, that would put you at the average benchmark. Now, interestingly with this, and this is how maths works, only 40% of players are actually striking at that rate or above. And this is where you might want to also factor in what the median strike rate is, which is 132.6. Elite, it's a nice round number, 150. If you're striking over 150, you can be pretty sure you're an elite striker. And then replacement level, bottom 25%, 123.5. And we're saying replacement level there because, effectively that's the point at which it's probable that you'd be able to find anybody else that could kind of do that job, or the next best player in your reserves would be able to come in and do that. Any thoughts on those benchmarks, Dan, before I pick out some players to provide examples?
Yeah, so obviously the mean and the median figures are different because you've probably got more of a gap between the biggest strike rates and the average strike rates compared to the average strike rates and the lowest strike rates. So that drags up the average to be higher than the median.
Yeah. Guys at the top of the list, the absolute smashers. Mohammed Harris in Pakistan is number one, 178.34. So he's got a slightly smaller sample size than some of the others, but 20 innings, that's not bad. Like, for a guy a lot of people in cricket will not have heard of, and who Pakistan don't seem to think is in their starting 11. It's unbelievable how good this guy's numbers are. Second, just slightly behind by about 1 run per 100 balls, is Heinrich Klaasen. So in the top 10 for average, second for strike rate of the players we're measuring. We've got Will Jacks, Adam Rossington at fourth. He's certainly bloomed in terms of T20 cricket. Again, not a guy England consider for selection there, and Will Jacks obviously not given a contract by England too. So some quite shocking findings, I think. Like in terms of who's at the top here, Andre Russell, Tim David, and Surya Kumar Yadav. So I've read out a few there because I think it's quite.
Finn Allen must be up there as
well. Finn Allen. I will find him, Dan. He is 146.3, which puts him in the top 14%. So a little bit lower down, but
lower than I thought. Yeah.
Yeah, there might be. He might be a player that's developing, and this is based off just 16 innings. So it might be the fact.
That's because you're not including a Super Smash.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, or international cricket.
It could be like top. It'll be top 5.
Yeah, and it doesn't include international cricket as well, because then you end up pulling in loads of guys from like Ireland and stuff like that. So there's and AB de Villiers is still on this list, even though he's retired. Like, so you got to factor in a few things like that, and so on. But that gives you an illustration of who is really good. What did I say the benchmark was for average? I think I said it was 135. If we're looking at the average player, Sam Billings, 134.98. So, and remember, that puts him in the top 40% of players. So the average here is actually pretty good relative to the player pool. But that's about average. Quinton de Kock in that range as well, and Devon Conway is another big name that people will know. Dan, we've done strike rate. I think we're going to break things down into boundary percentage and bits like that. 5-ball strike rate and 10-ball strike rate as well. So it's going to get strike rate heavy after the break. We are going to take a quick pause though. Just a reminder to make sure that you like and subscribe to Strike Rate, the Cricket Analytics podcast, on whichever platform you're listening on, and reach out to Dan at SA Advantage on Twitter if you have any questions. Get involved in the conversation, because there's a lot to talk about, and we want to hear your thoughts. Back in a minute.